You are listening to Unstoppable Mindset, where inclusion, diversity, and the unexpected meet. I'm your host, Mike Hinkson, and our guest today is Martine Kalaw. I made sure I pronounced that right because I even asked her. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you, Michael.
Martine is an author. She has written a book entitled The ABCs of Diversity, and she'll tell us more about what that's all about. She has been involved in diversity, inclusion, and equity for some time and has a lot of stories to tell. So we'll get right to it. Martine, thanks very much again for being here.
Thank you so much for having me, Michael. It's a pleasure.
Well, tell me a little bit about you growing up, sort of how you got started and all that kind of stuff. That's always a fun place to start.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll start by, I was unpacking some boxes and I found my college senior thesis. And the topic was I conducted comparative analysis between Bosnian refugees and Sudanese refugees to see if there was preferential treatment in their assimilation acculturation process in the local community. So that just goes to show where the background of DEI, where it first came from, where my interests lie. So when I was in college, I was undocumented, I was stateless. And, so part of my interest in the immigrant refugee community was also to see if there was preferential treatment based on race, but based on ethnicity, etc. So that just kind of illustrates, that DEI has always been the framework of a lot of the things I did. So immigration is a subset of DEI, but then even within immigration, there are other subsets of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and categories of diversity. And then I'll just kind of circle back around and also highlight that my interest in DEI and in the topic of diversity, equity, and inclusion really stems from, like I said, being undocumented, being stateless, and being orphaned and having to immerse myself in different communities, right? So I had to learn to acclimate in different communities, whether I went to a predominantly white prep school in Charlottesville, Virginia, or I lived in the dorms with mostly other international students, or being undocumented and stateless and being part of that subset, that community. Just gave me exposure to different communities, different subsets. And what that did was it allowed me to learn how to navigate and speak their language, or at least understand things and pivot my lens and understand their perspective. And my goal has always been to kind of be a bridge builder where there's lack of understanding or misunderstanding. What I can do is sort of help to liaise that. So that's really where the interest around DEI really stemmed from. And like I said, it continued on to college, and it's resulted in the work that I've been doing for the last 5+ years.
So one has to ask, what did you conclude in your college paper about preferential treatment for one of the cultures or the other?
There was. So that I actually did conduct field study, which was just absolutely riveting. For anyone who may have known, both of these countries had gone through civil wars, experienced, were impacted by genocide. So the local upstate community that I was a part of, because I went to Hamilton College, had, brought in refugees from these two communities and helped them in terms of, I wouldn't say rehabilitation, but settling into the communities. But there was bias, right? The bias existed in their access to housing, access to ESL, English as a second language, access to jobs, right? And it had a lot to do. There were some racial undercurrents tied to that. So absolutely, that's what I understood and I learned, and also really understood the distinction between when we talk about inclusion. What does that mean? Does it really mean multiculturalism, or does that really mean assimilation? Us expecting someone else to assimilate to our culture, our beliefs, our standards.
So when you say there was preferential treatment, was that in a negative sense, that they were not given the treatment that they really needed to have, or they got too much, or what?
Yeah. So the Sudanese refugees did not get the same adequate treatment as the Bosnian refugees in the local community in upstate New York.
And why was that?
Well, I mean, one would say that there were a lot of biases related to race.
Race and so on.
Race, because when you looked at it, a lot of the Sudanese refugees, actually, it could have been race, but then also religion perhaps was an undercurrent. Ethnicity could have been another element of it. But most likely it was driven by race. Yeah.
Primarily Black as opposed to white and so on.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Now, you mentioned that you were orphaned and stateless, as it were. Tell me more about all of that.
Yeah. I was born in Zambia. My family's from the DR Congo, came to the US when I was very young with my mother. And, she and my stepfather passed away by the time I was 15 years old. And, my stepfather was American born US citizen. My mother was a green card holder. Unfortunately, as she was in the process of securing her US citizenship, she passed away. And then, I fell out of status, and there I was trying to navigate just having a home, having a place to live. And little did I know that I was without status, and did not learn that until many years later when there was very little recourse that I could take in terms of establishing or reestablishing my status. And then at that point is when I learned that I was also stateless. The country that I was born in, Zambia, didn't recognize me as a citizen because I needed to claim citizenship of the country by the time I was 18, which I didn't know that. The country that my birth mother and birth father were born in, the DR Congo, was Zaire when my mother and father left. So the government changed, the country, the name, everything changed, the sovereignty changed. And so I couldn't establish my status there either, and the US didn't want me. So in those regards, I was not a citizen of any country. And there are a myriad of people who are stateless to this day. I mean, there are about over 10 million, according to UNHCR, there are over 10 million stateless persons in the world. In the US, there are over 200,000 plus stateless people. These are individuals that, don't have any recourse. They're more likely to be human trafficked because there are no laws written for them. And also, according to UNHCR, the statistic is that every 10 minutes, a stateless child is born, right? With climate change, all of these different wars that occur, people are displaced. There's certain laws where you can only obtain citizenship through your paternal connection, various reasons and laws and regulations that can lead someone to becoming stateless. So
have you been able to resolve that in your particular case? Or?
Yes, absolutely. I am a U.S. citizen, and I have I have been since, 2013. So I'm one of the very fortunate ones. It's very rare for the outcome, for someone from my background being stateless and, just my own, my background, my history, where I come from, to be in this position where I am now running a DEI business, and I have U.S. citizenship. I have a U.S. passport, and so forth. So that is a privilege in itself.
How are you able to deal with it, since there are so many that aren't or can't? What were you able to do that proved successful?
There isn't a particular, one of the reasons I hesitated in the past to, speak publicly and give and mentor others was because there isn't a prescription to this. Mm-hmm. The immigration system is broken in a lot of countries, particularly in the US, and it's not designed for people to succeed. It's designed for people to get stuck in this quagmire and fail, quite honestly. And so I cannot tell someone if they do this, X, Y, Z, if they follow the exact process that I follow, it will guarantee the same outcome, because it's almost as random as the roll of the dice, the outcome that can occur. So, what I do say is that, it's important to maintain your dignity, because this is the space, this is an institution, or an ecosystem where one can lose their dignity. So it's important to maintain your dignity. And one of the ways to maintain your dignity is to remember your source of power. It's very easy to feel powerless, to not feel like you have any influence, to not feel like you have a country, to not feel like you have a home, but to remember that your voice is your source of power, that your intelligence, like you can educate yourself about the policies, about the process. You can be your own advocate, even working with an attorney. So these are the things that I like to remind people. And also, allowing others to understand and see and humanize individuals who are undocumented or stateless, and to see them as an asset, and to see them as not charity, but as human beings who can actually be a great investment to our society, to our economy. And really, when you think about that, that translates into the work that I do within DEI, right? It's getting the work that I do around DEI and supporting organizations and companies, and especially human resources professionals, is getting them to understand and see the value, the impact that diversity, equity, and inclusion can have on the company, on the bottom line, on revenue. It's not just the right thing to do; it's the smart thing to do, and there's a benefit for everyone, right? It's not charity work, and it shouldn't be seen as charity work where we're just giving back through our DEI efforts.
So let me make this observation about what you were saying before. I think that the whole issue of being stateless, the whole issue that you faced and that you saw with two different countries that you compared treatments of people about, really plays right into the whole area of diversity and inclusion. And in reality, I know I and other persons with disabilities tend to experience that concept a lot. And I like what you said about keeping your dignity, because it is something that we all face. Blind people, for example, when we talk about diversity, blind and other persons with disabilities generally tend to be left out. We're not included. When you talk about diversity, when most people talk about diversity, they'll talk about race and culture and gender and so on. And you rarely hear disabilities mentioned, which is unfortunate. And it's really difficult to get people to start to talk about that in the conversation.
Michael, I absolutely agree. And I think that when we talk about, blindness, any other types of disabilities, physical disabilities, neurodiversity, various other categories of diversity. I think that the overarching challenge, even when it comes to race, is that people don't want to say the wrong thing, right? And so they say nothing at all, which they don't realize can be more harmful and hurtful, and can mute people, right? And make them feel invisible. It's like, I hear when I lead conversations on race relations, I'm leading workshops, people say, well, I don't want to say the wrong thing, so I'm not going to say anything at all. Sometimes CEOs who happen to be white males will say, I don't want to get involved. I don't want to offend anyone. I don't want to say the wrong thing. I'm sure my opinion doesn't matter in this conversation. And I say quite the opposite. Your opinion does matter. We want everyone's voice in this conversation. And to me, diversity, equity, inclusion means creating a safe space where people can engage in discussion, can share their stories, and can ask questions without fearing saying the wrong thing. And the listener, the recipient, can also, when they're asked a question or someone makes a statement that doesn't sit right with them, they can first consider that perhaps the person's intentions are good. They just don't know. It's coming from ignorance rather than malice. And that hasn't really been established, in this space of DEI. And that's what I think is important for companies to do, is to establish that, so that therefore no one's on these sidelines. No one, if you have a disability, you're not on the sidelines because the conversation is solely about race, right? Everyone should be included. It shouldn't be just focusing on, sexual orientation or race or gender or ethnicity or what have you, or nationality. It should include every category of diversity. And
it should. I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, I do agree with you. I do agree that when we think diversity, when the conversation around diversity, equity, inclusion begins, oftentimes the central focus are gender, race, and ethnicity. And the others are kind of like, become a byproduct of those three overarching diversity categories. Now,
even though when we really look at it, the category of persons with disabilities is 25% of all Americans. It's a very large group. And the fact is, it doesn't tend to get included, which is why, like, people like me, for example, I tend to define diversity as different from inclusion, because if you're truly going to be inclusive, then you are or you're not. There's no middle ground. Well, we include some people. You're not inclusive then. Well, and we have to change that attitude. And I think you sort of hit on part of it, which is mostly when it comes to disabilities, I think we're dealing with fear. Yeah, we are dealing with people who are different, and we tend to be uncomfortable with difference. But I think we also have been so conditioned, especially with physical disabilities, because non-physical disabilities are less visible. Nevertheless, they're still part of the process. But we deal with fear. Oh my gosh, I don't want to become like them. I could become like them, and we can't have that. Those are the kinds of things that we see all the time.
Wow, I appreciate the honesty in that, because I think that if we want to get to the root of the conversation around DEI, we've got to get real, and I do think that is real. I will say, just to kind of backtrack a little bit. One of the reasons, I agree with you that there's a fear, but another reason why the conversation around diversity starts with race and gender, ethnicity, is because it's sometimes the most obvious, right? It's not always so obvious because sometimes our perception of somebody's race or gender is not actually how they self-identify. However, there are more physical attributes that we can pinpoint that tie back to race, gender, ethnicity, right? And so that is the reason I believe that's one of the reasons why that's a prevalent, that's the prevalent conversation, but also because there is a gap, right? I mean, we know, and we can acknowledge that, race relations has been an issue in our country for hundreds of years, and it hasn't really changed, and it's shown up in structural racism in different spaces in our society. So that's one of the reasons, right? But at the same time, I also agree with you that diversity in the realm of disability or ableness has been overlooked. And I do agree that there are two elements of fear. One is fear of saying the wrong thing and offending someone, right? I don't want to say, am I using the right term, right? Because DEI, like the way that it's been presented in the last couple of years, it's like it puts people on guard where they feel like they have to be politically correct. They have to say the right thing. They don't know what to say, so they don't want to say anything at all, right? That's why my book is called The ABCs of Diversity, because we make it too complicated. So that's one of the reasons. One fear is people don't want to say the wrong thing. They don't want to. They think back, right? We all think back. Many of us can think back to when we were children. If we saw someone in a wheelchair, we pointed and our parents would say, don't do that. Like the acknowledgement of the person in the wheelchair was a bad thing. There was nothing wrong with acknowledging that someone's in a wheelchair. Like, that's actually good. But our parents didn't want to, would try to like suppress us because they didn't want us to offend the person. So we carry that into our adult life, and we think we don't want to say the wrong thing. But in addition to that, what you're saying, I agree with, is there is that fear of, well, if I focus on this thing or this person or this aspect of this person, then it makes it more real, and then it could be me, right? And I think that's very honest. And I haven't heard that before, but I think if we want to be really honest with ourselves, that is that's the truth.
The kind of fear that I think is also typified by a lot of what you're saying is, let's look at blindness, for example. And this started with teachers, with educators, and a lot of the professionals in the field of, if you will, work for the blind and with the blind. You generally hear people say blind or visually impaired. And there are two problems with that. Visually, I don't think so. We don't look different because we're blind. So visually is a problem. Vision impaired is a little bit more of an acceptable term, but the reality is then you get to impaired. Why do we have to be viewed as less than other people? Which is, and deaf people have realized this, because they would shoot you if you said deaf or hard of hearing, or deaf or hearing impaired. They prefer deaf or hard of hearing. And I think that it is more appropriate to say blind or low vision, but get the impaired out, because that is a buzzword that creates fear right off the bat.
And my question is, thank you for sharing. My question, Michael, is there a space for people to make those mistakes and learn? Because I think that's part of the fear, right? The fear is, I don't know what's the right terminology. And it's similar to someone asking me or not knowing whether they can refer to me as Black or African American. So then they just try to avoid my color. And I'm okay with them saying, I'm not really sure what the right terminology is. And I can say, you know what? I'm not either, because someone who looks like me standing next to me, the same skin tone as me, might say they're African American, and I say I'm Black. So it's okay to ask. And I'm okay with someone making that mistake, because I know that I don't expect everyone to know. And I think so that's where we gotta, that's the the crux of the challenge that we have around DEI is just that example itself. I did not know that saying visually impaired is not appropriate, right?
Well, no, and let me be real clear. Most people still say that, including blind people. I'm saying, think about the concept of visually impaired. Visually, what does that have to do with it? Because I don't look different because I'm blind. Impaired, that means that I'm generally in the fear world considered less because I'm not impaired, but you're visually impaired. And so the issue is, I think blind people are still learning that words matter. So to answer your question, yes, there is always space. And some people might be offended, just like there are people of different races who may be offended if you call them one thing or another, but there certainly should be space to deal with it. I was in a
conversation and to educate and to learn.
Sure, absolutely. Right? And that is really what it's all about. I was in a shopping mall, or actually at a store, in an IKEA store. Then this young man came up to me and he said, "I'm sorry." And I said, why are you sorry? And he said, "I'm sorry you can't see." And my immediate reaction, and I said it was, "Well, I'm really sorry that you can. Why are you sorry?" "Well, you can't see things."
Great response. I love that. Yeah.
Yeah. And I said, "Look, eyesight really doesn't have anything to do with it." And by that time, his mother came over and dragged him away, which goes back to what you said before. So we didn't get to continue the discussion. But the reality is, I think on all sides, we need to recognize that words matter. And we do need to change and have the conversation. So it is something that is extremely important to do, because the reality is I'm not impaired. If we want to deal with it that way, then you are blind impaired, and I'm just as correct to say that as you are saying that I'm vision or visually or sight impaired. And both of those are not the way we should really deal with it.
Yeah. And I, something you said around words matter. I was actually doing work with a client maybe last year, and, with a company, and basically helping them to define what their DEI corporate statement was, their philosophy. And as I was interviewing and speaking to different leaders, what I learned, one of them said, we should just wipe away the words that we're using, like all this terminology that we use, and let's just come up with our own. And that's really, what I'm hearing you say. I feel like in the space of DEI and the history in the last couple of years, we're just collecting a bunch of lingo that we're hearing, right? In the media, coming from the academic space. And then we don't really know what it means, and we just use it because it sounds good. It sounds right. Whereas what we can do, what probably would make more sense, is engage in discussion with people, but asking permission, right? It's one thing to just start to, start asking someone to explain, someone who's blind, whether they prefer to be, referred to as visually impaired or blind or what have you, rather than first asking, is it okay for me to ask you some more questions, right, about your identity? And then if the person says yes, then you can engage in that discussion. And that's where the learning happens, right? And your interpretation, your feelings, how you want to self-identify might look different from somebody else who also happens to be blind, right? And that's okay too, but we can't learn, we can never navigate that until we start to undo these terminologies that we learn, because we're so caught up in being politically correct and using the right jargon, but in the end, we're really not, right? Like when we talk about, it's interesting, Latinx, or Latinx is a common terminology now that is used for individuals who are from, are Latin American or Hispanic, but I'm learning that it's generational, right? Someone who is in their 60s might not respond to being called Latinx, who's from Dominican Republic. They might just say, hey, refer to me as Dominican, or no, I'm Latina or Latino. So I think it's just about getting in a space where we can have discussion, ask questions, and not be immediately offended, because we know that the person's intentions are to learn. And something else that you said around inclusion, you said something around like what real inclusion doesn't necessarily, what real inclusion looks like. And I actually, as I mentioned earlier, in my senior thesis in college, what I realized is that, inclusion has different definitions. So you almost have to ask people, what do you mean by inclusion, right? Because inclusion can mean, hey, let's all come as we are and be in this space together, and we're all equal in this space. Or inclusion can look like, come and join us and be part of us. So become like us. And that's more of like assimilation, acculturation, right? And so when organizations, when clients say we really want to foster inclusion, the next best question that I ask is, what does that mean? What do you mean by inclusion? Tell me what that actually looks like.
Yeah, but if we look at the definitions that exist today, there are definitions of inclusion. And so I still submit that in reality, in the long run, if we don't force people to adhere to a definition of inclusion that doesn't leave anyone out, then we're doing a disservice. We've already done that with diversity, and diversity doesn't really necessarily allow for inclusion. It recognizes difference, but we don't recognize all differences as equal anyway. But when you get to the concept of inclusion, you are either going to recognize that in some way all of us are part of the same world, or you're not truly inclusive. And that's part of what we do need to deal with. And so, for example, when you talk about companies that are making statements and creating diversity and inclusion statements, I think one of the things that the industry has to start doing more of is making sure that disabilities are included in the statements. Because if we don't start pushing the conversation, we're not going to ever really be able to have the conversation, because we'll continue to be left out. Attitude about blindness, for example, people constantly say to me, or I read when people write about me leaving the World Trade Center, Michael Hinkson was led down the stairs by his guide dog, Roselle, which is absolutely the worst and most atrocious thing people can say, because it implies I don't really have anything to do with the process, and guide dogs don't guide or lead, they guide. It's my job to give the dog directions command by command, and the dog's job to make sure that we walk safely. But people don't get that, and we need to start creating conversations in general that hopefully will lead people to an idea that maybe our view is not really what it ought to be.
Yeah. I couldn't agree more. And I think it does partly, it needs to also, inclusion is one element, but diversity is another. And diversity is about representation. And if you think about, a lot of organizations and companies, they have not established a space where they're inviting more individuals who have disabilities. So that's the challenge, right? There needs to be an opportunity to have a broader reach, right? And find candidates who can work. First of all, they've got to create positions and jobs where someone with a particular disability can actually, be able to fully do the job and has the equipment and, all of that to do the job. But then in addition to that, we've got to have a broader reach, right? Organizations have not really in general done a lot of that, enough of that yet. So therefore, right, that voice isn't reinforced in the conversation around inclusion. It needs to.
And hence we have the unemployment rate among persons with disabilities in this country today being between 65 and 70%. And it's not because people who happen to have a disability can't do the job. It's that
That's right.
Others think we can.
Yeah, others think you can't, and they're not looking. They're not searching. Their pools are so limited, right? Their pools are limited. The pools are out there, but companies aren't reaching far enough out to identify those candidates. And the thing about it that I always emphasize is that, it's not, when you're searching and you're broadening your reach, it's not that you're reducing or watering down the quality, the qualifications of the applicant, because the applicant is going to apply in the same pool as, other applicants, the pools that you typically look at. So for example, if you start to broaden your reach and you happen to have a candidate, who is blind and can do the job, and they apply for the position and they're qualified and they're competing with other candidates that are not blind, they get the position. Then what difference does it make? Right?
Because that's not usually what happens. Of course, what happens is in a job interview, the first question that's asked is, how are you even going to get to work? It doesn't matter that we got there for the interview, and it doesn't matter what the resume says. And most all of us can tell you horror stories about how recruiters and others have treated us when we get to an interview. And for the most part, people tend to not even say in advance that they're blind. Of course, it's a double-edged sword, because if you don't say you're blind and you get the interview, then the defenses go up when you get there. But if you do say you're blind before the interview, it's a difficult process to deal with, but there's a way to address that. But if you do say you're blind, you won't generally even get a letter back acknowledging that you sent in a resume. And so that's why I'm saying I think that the DEI industry, the professionals in the industry, need to start to really help push the conversation, because it's not that we're not trying, but it's that we're being ignored. We've got this is National Disability Awareness Month and National Blindness Employment Awareness Month. October 15th is National White Cane Day. None of that gets mentioned in the media. None of that gets mentioned in the general conversation, and that's what we really need to change. So, those are things that do have to be addressed. But I know your time is short. Tell me about your books. You said we talked about one, but tell me about your books.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Michael, we should absolutely circle back, because this is something that, I definitely agree that DEI practitioners in-house, out, those who have their own businesses and work alongside companies, we can do more. That's one of the things we can do. And I'd love to learn about more organizations that I can connect with, so that, I can, if I'm working with a company and they're looking to recruit more applicants, they're looking for interns, right? I can redirect them to an organization where they can find applicants who are from an underrepresented group, being disability, a particular disability. So I do think that there's more effort that we can all do. And so I appreciate you sharing that. And then so back to, to your question, my first book is it's called Illegal Among Us, A Stateless Woman's Quest for Citizenship. And that was my memoir, which just gives you, it's kind of a guide on how I went from where I was as an undocumented stateless person to where I am today, and how I navigated through a broken immigration system. And the second book, which is also available on Amazon and is also a an audiobook, is the ABCs of Diversity, a manager's guide to diversity, equity, and inclusion in the new workplace. So it's really meant to read, to be like a primer on diversity, breaking it down, and how managers specifically can incorporate this into their everyday practices. So when we think about foundational manager development, diversity falls and reinforces that, because managers are involved in hiring, in recruiting, in promotions, in compensation. All of those elements of foundational manager development have an element of diversity, equity, and inclusion within them. And so this book becomes a primer. Each chapter has an application that where you can, self-reflect, and then a piece where you can apply it to your everyday job and to your direct reports. And so I encourage everyone to, tune in, get a copy on Amazon. And also I have a masterclass every month. You can go on my website, martinekalaw.com, and sign up. It's a complimentary masterclass on DEI. It's mainly focused on, it's targeted to human resources professionals who are trying to implement DEI effectively in your organizations. So they can join in for an hour. I will give them the top 7 things that they can do in the next 90 days to really move DEI forward. The next session is October 18th, and then there's another one in November, and then so forth.
Spell your name and the website again. Spell it all out if you would.
Yes, absolutely. It's Martine, MartineKalaw.com. So www.martinekalaw.com. And when you go there, you'll be able to find a link to both of my books as well as the masterclass.
Well, I hope people will reach out. I think this is a fascinating discussion, and I think we should continue it. I believe it will be great to do that. And I think we, between us, have a lot to offer people. I'd love to hear how you who are listening to this feel about this. Please shoot us an email. You can reach me, Michael H.I. at accessibe.com. And you can go to our podcast page if you're getting this elsewhere, michaelhingson.com/podcast. But either way, we hope you'll give this a 5-star rating when you review it. And I hope that you will email Martine and me with your thoughts. We'd love to hear what you think. And maybe you'd like to come on the podcast and talk about it. So Martine, again, thanks very much. I really appreciate your time and that you got a chance to be here.
Thank you, Michael. It's been a pleasure.